Good afternoon, everybody, and hello from Smudge to Karen Frankel here with you on a Friday afternoon. As usual, it's so lovely to have you on board. Today, landscape. I've got 5 steps for you to draw successful landscapes or paint successful landscapes. So all of these steps will apply no matter what medium you are using. I haven't quite made up my mind today whether I'll be working in graphite pencil or charcoal, but it actually doesn't matter because all of these steps will apply regardless of whether you're drawing or painting, whether you're using ink, charcoal, pastels, crayons, whatever. Okay, so I've got a number of examples of landscapes just to show you on the screen, because the first step is to find your view. Probably the most crucial thing to do when you are looking to draw a landscape is actually to choose a view, and it's something I talk about in my holiday sketching from home, travel sketching from home. So if you got that course free with your pre-orders, don't forget to go and have a look at it. I'm sure you will find some helpful tips there to follow my demonstrations. If you haven't got it yet, after this video you can jump in onto my website and go and get that travel sketching from home course. And when you are faced with something that you've got on that screen there, obviously that's a panorama shot, but sometimes you'll be looking out at the vista and you will see something like that, and you will say to yourself, I have no idea how to capture something like that. How do I even begin to deal with it? And so it is very, very important for you to practice that. In the case of this particular panorama, if you had a panorama canvas that you wanted to fill, or if you made your sketchbook long and thin, you could probably tackle this more easily than you think, because I can see some quite simple shapes in that picture. And so when you are looking at landscapes, it's about finding simple shapes. And simplification is something that is paramount pretty much for everything we draw, as far as I'm concerned. But sometimes the landscape is so overwhelming. We can see so well, we can see all the trees, we can see the people, we can see the boats, we can see the houses, we can see the dogs, we can see everything in it, and we have a tendency to want to put everything in. So simplification combined with the view is what we're looking at. So how do we simplify and find a view? The first thing that I like to do is to use a viewfinder. Finding a view means narrowing down that broad landscape to a small section. And your best friend is your telephone camera. Okay, short of that, just your fingers, or even a bigger hole with 2 hands like that. What that does in effect is also help you to zoom in. So if we look at the view on screen, if I zoom in, I simplify that picture. So cropping and zooming, which is what your viewfinder does. So let's say something like that. Even though, because I've zoomed in on the computer, I can actually see more detail, I've simplified the shapes that I can now see. So zooming in, finding a view, you can obviously zoom in on your camera on your phone or your real camera. Optical zoom is better than digital zoom, but it doesn't really matter which one you use when you're trying to find a view. So that's your first thing you do. Because I'm on the computer, it's quite easy for me to shift this picture around so that the tree, the left-hand tree, is on my left-hand third line, vertical line, and I have now moved it down so that the treetops are more or less on the bottom third line. Okay, when you are looking through your viewfinder, finding a view, try and make sure that you have a major horizontal line, very often your horizon, especially if you haven't got trees in the way, a major horizontal line on one of the third lines and a major vertical line on one of the vertical third lines. So those are your first two steps. Find a view, zoom in, enclose, not enclose, take away the vastness of the landscape by bringing it down with your viewfinder, and then imagine that your main verticals and horizontals fall on one of those thirds. One of the things that helps us choose our view, if you have an interesting land portion, then you might want to have, I can put it right up there like that, and have all of that land portion in the foreground, have the top level where that red car is on the top third line, and then the trees. So if you're interested in the land, then have your major horizontal line in the top third. However, in this picture, there's a lovely, lovely sky. And there's beautiful clouds there. So I might even do that and take that big tree out completely and have that much smaller tree on the third line and have those beautiful, beautiful clouds as the main part of the picture. Actually, maybe even that tree would suit. So you can see there that I have styled it so the majority of the picture is that sky, and the major horizontal and vertical lines fall on those thirds. So that's your step number 2. Easy, right? Not so difficult. This was a very, very wet day in Derby, and you can see that the road in front is very, very wet. You can see that the horizontal line is right in the middle. Be aware that when you pick up your camera or your viewfinder, it will automatically be at your eye level. And if you remember from previous videos, your eye level is the same as the horizon. So naturally, when we pick up our camera, we end up with the horizon dead in the middle of our picture. And what I'm telling you now in finding your view is to move that horizon either to the lower third or to the upper third. If I want to take an actual photograph and change where the horizon is, I will either have to tilt my camera a bit down or tilt it a bit up. So remember that naturally the horizon will fall in the center of your photographs because the horizon matches your eye level. Okay. Now, however, with digital cameras, particularly, especially if they've got a fold-out screen, you can hold the camera around about your tummy and look down at the view, and then you'll also see that the horizon will change. So that photograph is a very good example of how the horizon falls in the middle. It's not the most interesting photograph, but it can become an interesting photograph. So if I zoom in on that, I don't like that road particularly. It's a man-made road. Although the sky isn't very busy, it's a misty sky. If I zoom in, once again, If I want to make the vast skies of the Pilbara, I don't know if Derby is actually Pilbara, but you can see I've put the main juncture of those two big trees around that left-hand third, and I've put the horizon on the bottom third. If we change it up and move it up, yeah, maybe that road could be interesting. That could be a nice semi-abstract, so not exactly as the road is there. It could be like that. But this is all to do with your first and second steps. Find a view, zoom in, and use your rule of thirds. But I want to show you how you can simplify something like this and change it up, and that is the painting that I did from it. So when I say it doesn't apply to the rule of thirds, that's because the horizon in the background is still slap bang in the middle. But I think it works because the dark section falls at the bottom there, which is, see if I can bring up, yeah, which is on that bottom third. And then the trees fill the next third, and the right-hand tree, the tallest tree, kind of fits on your right-hand third there. First rule was zooming in, finding a view, making the big vast landscape a little bit smaller with your camera or your piece of cardboard. So I'm drawing very small, obviously, so that you can see it fitting in between the photograph and me on the side there. The second thing was to go with the rule of thirds, so that when you're actually looking through your viewfinder, move it around so that the major horizontal fits on one of these thirds and the major vertical fits on one of those thirds. Okay, now for simplifying tonal shapes. I'm going to put in the major shapes that I can see. So I can see that landmass, and in fact I've put it in the wrong place. I can see the landmass is around here because it's the tree line that fits on that third. Can you see that I'm not actually drawing a tree? Now I know your head will be screaming at you to start drawing trees and start drawing the dirt and start drawing all that sort of thing. But I promise you this technique will work. Okay, so the general tonal shapes. You've heard the words shapes of tone from me many times. I'm half closing my eyes, I'm looking at that picture, and in fact not only have I got the line of the land there, I've got a shadow line there as well. So there's three lines. There's the edge of the shadow, there's the bit of land, and then there's trees, which falls on that bottom third. Remember that part of drawing is adjusting as well, so don't over worry about this, or don't worry at all, in fact, about this not being what you think it should be. Okay, now if I'm half closing my eyes, I can see that main mass of dark there with a circle of bushes doing that, and it goes to the top of that landmass, and then we've got kind of a whitish, and I've made it much too thick. So what I've actually done wrong is my usual advice on drawing trees is draw the foliage first. So put the shape of the foliage in first, and then you can put your trunk in. So I drew it way, way, way too big. And remember, this is all about shapes of tone as well. So we're not worrying about anything major. This could be a thumbnail for you, or you could be drawing right into your landscape. And believe it or not, I know that looks a bit ugly at the moment, but I promise you it's going to turn into a landscape. Fingers crossed. Anyway, so the rest of my landscape is going to be full of sky. Pretty much the only thing I would do at this point in terms of any erasing would be to rub out those third lines, especially for the sky. And in fact, I will give you a tip. Usually, if I'm drawing straight onto my page, or if I'm using a thumbnail and I'm drawing straight onto my page, from that, I usually have my third lines indicated on the edges and not all the way through, especially if I've got something like a sky that I want there. And that helps you just to align things up without necessarily drawing on the page. Okay, so my sky, I'm not actually going to put some shapes in at the moment, because if I half close my eyes, the sky all is one tone pretty much. Okay, so that's Simplify Tonal Shapes. I've just drawn the shapes. I haven't actually colored in any of the tones. And for that, I want to take our fourth step into account. The fourth step is to think about the foreground, middle ground, and background of your picture. And your shapes of tone need to indicate whereabout in the landscape you are. So this is about getting depth. So I know before I've done a video on how to step into the landscape, and it was a lesson on perspective and how to feel as if you're walking down into the painting towards the horizon. This is part of the same thing, but simpler. In your foreground, generally speaking, often you have your most intense tones in the foreground. So I'm not putting in any of the rocks and sand and character that I can see in the picture. I'm just putting in the foreground, which is at the bottom of your page. I'm putting in the general tone. Okay, you can, of course, let me see where my kneadable eraser is. You can, if you wish, leave out subtle little places like that, but it's probably too early to start that, because I know if you start that now, you will end up doing that, getting far too involved in that much too soon. Okay, so foreground is about these intense tones which come forward. Middle ground is about slightly less intense. Now, the things are a bit smaller because of perspective, but if I generically, so I'm not even putting in shapes of trees, right? Except I shouldn't have drawn that trunk quite as strong as I've drawn it. I'm putting in a middle ground. I'm going to use my kneadable eraser to just soften back that tree trunk. Now, remember that this is a demonstration of these principles, of these steps. If I were drawing this, I would be going much more slowly in putting all these things down. So please don't take it that you need to work at this kind of speed. I am simply indicating the steps to take. Now that I've seen that, and I would ordinarily have this book tilted towards me, so I'm actually looking up at the screen to see what it looks like. I'm looking at the difference between this tone and that, and I'm finding that a bit too strong compared to this. So I've got two options. I can either deepen this one, or I can take my kneadable eraser and I can soften that one. So both of those help. Now, I have got a little bit of dark here in my photograph. And so in your focal point, which is where your two main lines intersect, so your horizontal and your vertical, that is generally where you have your strongest change in tone. And I've just realized that there's a lovely dark tree going off the side there, which might actually work pretty well. So I'm actually going to put it in. So this smaller dark area is not really going to hinder the change from the foreground into the middle ground, okay? Because it is part of this intersection where the darkest dark meets the lightest light. So I'm just going to color that in. This is more a thumbnail than a finished work. Okay, so that's that bush without me having put any marks in. And these strong lines are way, way, way too strong, I have to admit. But I am going to just color them in as generic blobby shapes of trees. How's that looking? So when I look up on the screen, I immediately see that I've just noticed that I've colored that in way too dark for it to be going behind that tree. So I'm going to knock that back. And now I would also be putting in some of the changes in the sky. If we get back to the sky now, this very soft, these soft clouds, I'm using my kneadable eraser to come in there and soften them. This is an HB pencil because I want some nice couple of sharper edges underneath the clouds. Now that line came from when I was showing you the third lines. So I'm actually going to soften that back, and I'm going to indicate some of these trees. So I am not putting in detail at this stage. I'm still keeping the nature of the tonal values, but I am changing the edge so that it replicates foliage. So this is when we come to our mark making, and you can see that the fact that we had tones under there already was important. You can add, even though it's the middle distance, you can add small areas of dark like I'm doing here, which is showing the undergrowth. But I'm not putting too much detail. I'm just putting some character in. I'm not going to put that tiny car in. Again, in my haste in doing these demonstrations, I've put these hard edges around those shapes of tone. Not a good idea. So I'm changing those shapes of tone by adding in some texture, which is making it look a little bit more tree-like. I hope that's working. I can still see my lines there, which I'm not happy about, but there you go. And a bit of the undergrowth goes across the tree. If you want to, you can come back in with your kneadable. I'm probably being a little bit picky there in picking out that lovely white trunk. But what I am trying to do is provide some mark making texture to show that it's trees and not just that generic colouring in. Is that looking a little bit better? Don't forget to go behind, right up against those changes in tone. You can also, of course, come in and take out a few lights because we had gone in so strongly, or I had gone in so strongly, not really we. And I'm actually going to put a little bit of tone in that light section. Okay, the last thing to do, the last step, is some detail. Now, I'm scared of saying detail because if you say detail, people are going to put in every single tiny little thing they see, and a bit of tuft of grass over there and a tiny shadows here. I don't want that kind of detail, so I am meaning character, which will help bring this foreground forward too. So this is your fifth step. If I now bring in some more character into this foreground, and I give some more shape or interest to those shadows, and I put in a few little clumps of shadows of sand and that sort of thing. Now I know in that light band in the photograph you can see lots of dots, but look what happens when I put them in. It makes this middle ground brings it too much forward, because in the middle ground you can't see that much detail or that much character. Okay, so that was a little bit of deliberate. It actually looks like a river coming through there now. So one way is to knock it back. It's also pretty hard to say where the foreground ends and where the middle ground begins. Ostensibly it's at that third line, but the main foreground is right down at the bottom of this picture, and then it fades off. And in fact, I think I'm going to widen that shadow area, and as I'm using my kneadable razor, I am using it in such a way that I've got shadow lights coming through, or lights coming through the shadows. What tends to happen is that your eyes zoom in and you want to put all those special darks in, that sort of thing. Don't do it. So think about your third step, which is simplify the tonal shapes. Don't then come back and put in some strong marks. I think that as a simplified landscape has worked. So don't come in and go, oh, I'm going to draw all of these trees and I'm going to put all of the leaves, etc., etc. To simplify landscape, we want to help with that impression that we're going into it, and that the middle ground is further away. We do not see any details there, and we hardly see any character, if at all. To recap, first, find a view with your viewfinder or your camera or your fingers, and remember that the horizon will be in the middle, so you have to tilt your camera a little bit to make it higher or make it lower. Second point is use your rule of thirds. Put the major horizontal on one of the third lines, that one or that one, depending on whether the sky is interesting or the ground is interesting, and put a major vertical on one of your vertical lines. So that's step number 2. Step number 3, simplify your tonal shapes. So don't do what I do and I drew a nice, hard line there and then I colored it in. You can simplify your tonal shapes just by coloring them in. You don't need to actually put a line around them. Number 4, be aware of the change in tone between the foreground, middle ground, and background. Foreground is your most intense, darker in many cases. Your middle ground is slightly lighter, although you can have some darks there, as long as the whole thing is generally lighter than your foreground. And then your background is your most faded, less intense. Okay? Now these rules do change. If you do an intense stormy sky, then the rules will change, but at least be aware of how they are working. Observe them and simplify them. So then the last thing is to add any small detail or large detail that provides character. So don't, come in and draw every single branch. Put the characters of what the branches might look like rather than, a stiff branch coming out. Okay? And those are your 5 steps. That picture, for example, that hasn't got a dark foreground, but if I were drawing that, I would not make the whole of that land portion the similar tones. I probably would put a darker tone in that front section, and then lighten it, and then lighten it a bit more. So for me in this photograph, that back row of trees would need to be very, very much more softened off, so that they don't appear to compete with these foreground things. The tones on that whole picture are all the same as far as I'm concerned, but when I changed it to my picture, so this is what I meant when I said more intense. It's not really darker, so I guess the actual trees are darker, but that whole band of middle ground is not darker than that small band in the foreground there. I hope you've all enjoyed that little session on landscape. It is much easier than you think. You'll be producing some lovely landscapes. So lovely to have you on board for another Friday. I'm thoroughly enjoyed myself as usual. So it's Karen Frankel signing out, and guess what I'm going to say? Get drawing. See you next week. Bye-bye.